It is always interesting to look through the old videos by Professor Jordan Peterson on his personality lectures. Here, he is very frequently grappling with the scientific worldview, not because it's incorrect, but rather because it left many devoid of higher values. Peterson tries to combat the rise of nihilism and thinks how the scientific world can be supplemented by a world of meaning.
Since the dawn of the scientific world, and likely before that, we have tended to believe that we are subjects in a world of objects. And that's obviously a very useful way to view the world, and you can tell that because formalizing that in the form of science has enabled us to extend control over the world in ways that we were not able to before. To formulate the idea of an objective truth has been an extraordinarily useful maneuver. And so the idea roughly is that everyone's perceptions can be contaminated by their own biases and their own fantasies, the subjective biases and fantasies, and you can overcome that by stringently specifying the conditions under which an observation takes place. So that would be an experimental method. Having multiple people view the consequences separately, have them detail out what the consequences are, and then look for commonalities across them. And you think, well, the commonalities across the set of observations constitute a description of the objective world. And that's been insanely powerful, crazily powerful. I mean, that's not all there is to the scientific method, but it's a big part of it. Now, there's an emergent problem with that. Perhaps. It's complicated, but one of the emergent problems with that is maybe a consequence of stripping the subjectivity out of the world. So what science does is consider anything subjective a form of bias or error in the observation and then get rid of it. And so what you're left with when you formulate the scientific world is a world that's stripped of subjectivity. Now, the problem with that is that you're a subject, and so when you strip the world of its subjectivity, that sort of leaves you isolated, like an isolated being with no necessary connection to objective reality in the midst of a set of impersonal facts. And that seems to have psychological consequences. And the psychological consequences are that, well, for example, I think it's easier to develop a nihilistic sense of being, for example, if you believe that the world is nothing but objects and that you're fundamentally an object among many and not a particularly important one at that. So there are psychological consequences to adopting the scientific worldview. Prior to the emergence of the scientific worldview, people were more embedded in what you might think about as a mythological landscape, where every element of being had its place in something that approximated a master plan, or at least a meaningful plan. And so the idea of the meaningfulness of life was not necessarily such a pressing intellectual concern. And then, well, and so we don't know the full extent of that. I mean, I've talked to you a little bit about Nietzsche's idea expressed at the end of the 19th century about the death of God and his prognostication that the collapse of classic systems of meaning would open up people to possession by nihilism and also by potentially totalitarian political systems, and that seems to have been what happened. Now, Heidegger was very concerned about that, among other things. And so he decided to reconsider reality from the bottom up. And so what he did was generate an alternative set of axioms. He said something like, well, what if we decide to make reality everything that we experience? Forget about the subject-object divide. One of the other problems with the subject-object divide, for example, is accounting for consciousness, right? Because it's a problem that science really hasn't got any distance with at all, as far as I can tell. I mean, people have been trying to crack the secret of consciousness, obviously, for a very long time, but they've been trying to do it formally and using scientific methods, at least for the last 50 years, and my sense of that is that they've got absolutely nowhere. Maybe that's a bit unfair. We're better at representing how conscious experiences manifest themselves in the brain, but we're certainly no better at understanding how it is that we experience things. And that's the problem of qualia. That's how the philosophers describe it. And qualia is the quality of your experience, like the fact of pain, for example. I mean, the pain you feel is by no means identical, at least as far as you're concerned, to some pattern of neurological activity, right? It's pain. It seems to be a fundamental reality of some. In fact, I think pain is the fundamental reality. I think it's the only thing that people will never deny. So there are these aspects of your existence that are subjective, like your experience of color and your experience of beauty and just your experience of things, or maybe just your experience. And your experience plays a indeterminate role in the structure of being itself. Because you might ask, well, what would there be if there was nothing conscious? And you could say, well, what would there be if there was nothing conscious of being? Well, it's a tricky question because it depends on your a priori axioms, but it's not obvious what there would be in the absence of a conscious observer. There wouldn't obviously be any duration between things. It would be very difficult to specify things in terms of size. There wouldn't be any of the qualities that we experience our being as having, because color doesn't seem to be an intrinsic part of the world. Smell doesn't seem to be an intrinsic part of the world. It's very difficult. The more you think about it, you'd find the more difficult it is to determine exactly what there would be if there was no one to observe it. And that's not the tree in the forest idea precisely. It's not so much if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one to hear it, does it make a sound? Because that's more a matter of the definition of sound than anything else. This is more like if there's a tree in the forest and there isn't anyone, is there a tree? And that's a whole different question. Anyway, so what Heidegger did, partly because he was not pleased, I suppose, with the metaphysical consequences of the scientific worldview, and also perhaps because he wasn't very happy about our ability to account for consciousness, he decided to see what would happen if he played a different kind of game. And you can do that in an intellectual discussion. You know, you can say, well, here's a set of axioms out of which a system will emerge, like here's a set of rules out of which a game would emerge. Same idea. What if we start with a different set of rules? Let's see what we can do if we do that. You kind of do that when you play one video game rather than another. You know, there are little worlds that pop out. There's a different underlying structure, and then you can go inside that world and experiment with it and see what comes out of it. So Heidegger decided to say, well, okay, what we're going to do instead is we're going to assume that everything we experience is real. We're going to make our field of experience itself reality. And so that would mean, from Heidegger's point of view, that everything about the being that manifests itself to you is to be regarded as equally real. So then you think, well, that makes pain a fundamental reality. That makes anxiety a fundamental reality. It makes beauty and color fundamental realities. They're not self-evidently reducible to anything else, which they would be, which they are in from the scientific perspective, because you have to think about them as manifestations of some more fundamental underlying material reality. And I guess that's another problem with the subject-object model and the material model. When you aggregate atoms, when you arrange them in certain forms, when they manifest themselves as certain molecules and then in more complex structures, they seem to take on all sorts of qualities that you couldn't predict if you just knew about the subatomic particles and the atoms themselves. And so, of course, those are called emergent properties. And you say, well, you can observe hydrogen and you can observe oxygen, but that doesn't make it self-evident for you to be able to predict the properties of water. And of course, that's a much simpler problem, all things considered, than the problem of figuring you out. You're this crazily complex aggregate of these hypothetically simple entities, but it isn't obvious how their elemental properties can combine to produce you. It's not obvious at all. It's certainly not obvious how a material that's supposed to be dead matter, so to speak, can manifest consciousness, no matter how complexly it's arranged.
Thank you for watching this video, and if you like the content, subscribe to Philosophy Insights.